Okay, look, I know you've probably heard about unsolved celebrity murders before. You've seen the documentaries, read the theories, watched people speculate endlessly online. But the Jill Dando case? This one's different. And I need you to understand why it's different before you click away. April 26, 1999, 11:30 in the morning. Bright daylight. A quiet residential street in Fulham, West London. One of Britain's most beloved TV presenters, someone who millions of people invited into their homes every single night, was shot dead on her own doorstep with a single bullet to the head. No robbery, no witnesses, no clear motive. The killer just vanished. And here's the thing that'll keep you up at night. This sparked the biggest murder investigation in British history since the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper. Thousands of interviews, hundreds of officers, years of investigation. They even convicted someone and sent him to prison for 8 years. And the case is still unsolved. 25 years later, nobody knows who killed Jill Dando. So hit that subscribe button right now, because this story gets more insane with every twist. Before we get to the murder, and trust me, we'll get there, you need to understand who Jill Dando was. Because her fame, her face, her presence in millions of British homes, that's what makes this whole thing so disturbing. Jill Wendy Dando was born on November 9, 1961, in Weston-super-Mare, a seaside town in Somerset. She started her career the old-fashioned way, as a trainee reporter at the local newspaper, the Weston Mercury, where her father and brother also worked. But Jill had something special. Charisma, warmth, that quality you can't teach. She could make you feel like she was talking directly to you through the screen. By the mid-1980s, she'd joined the BBC, starting at BBC Radio Devon and then moving to regional television. By 1988, she'd made it to national news in London. And from there, she became a household name. She presented BBC Breakfast News, the 6 o'clock news, the holiday show Holiday, and Songs of Praise. But her biggest role, the one that would later fuel endless speculation about her death, was co-hosting Crimewatch UK with Nick Ross. Crimewatch, if you're not familiar with it, was this primetime show where they reconstructed unsolved crimes and asked the public for help. It was massive. Millions of viewers. And Jill was the face of it. Calm, compassionate, the person who looked you in the eye and said, "Someone out there knows something." People loved her. In 1997, she was named BBC Personality of the Year. She was called the Golden Girl of British television. She was compared to Princess Diana, not just in looks, but in her charisma and public appeal. By April 1999, Jill's life was pretty perfect, at least on paper. She'd just gotten engaged to gynecologist Alan Farthing. The wedding was planned for September. She was at the peak of her career, beloved by millions, with her whole future ahead of her. And then someone shot her in the head on a Monday morning. So here's how it went down. And I want you to picture this, because the mundane details make it even more horrifying. Jill had spent the night before at her fiancé Alan Farthing's house in Chiswick. On the morning of April 26th, around 11:30 a.m., she drove to her own house in Fulham, a blue BMW Z3 convertible. She was planning to pick up some faxes and paperwork before heading back. It was a beautiful spring morning. Broad daylight. People were out and about. This wasn't some dark alley at 3 a.m. This was a residential street in West London at lunchtime. As she approached her front door at 29 Gowan Avenue, someone grabbed her from behind, forced her to the ground, pressed a 9mm semi-automatic pistol to her left temple, and fired once. One shot. Execution style. The killer pressed the gun so hard against her head that it left an imprint on her skin. Then he just walked away. A neighbor discovered her body around 11:47 a.m., about 15 minutes after she was shot. She was rushed to Charing Cross Hospital, but was pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. Let me paint the full picture of how bizarre this was. Her next-door neighbor reported seeing a man, tall, around 40 years old, walking away from the scene. But here's the thing. He was walking, not running, calmly, like he'd just been for a stroll. No one heard the gunshot. Why? The weapon used was described as possibly having a silencer, or the killer had used some kind of muffling technique. Professional. Calculated. This wasn't some panicked attack. And get this. Witnesses later reported seeing a man loitering around the street the night before and the morning of the murder. So this might have been planned. Someone might have been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. The murder weapon? Never found. The bullet casing was recovered at the scene, but the gun itself? Gone. The British public was devastated. Thousands of people lined the streets of Weston-super-Mare for Jill's funeral. It was like losing Princess Diana all over again, this beloved figure, cut down senselessly. And the police? They went into overdrive. The investigation involved combing through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage, interviewing over 2,500 people, and taking more than 1,000 statements. There were 7,000 lines of inquiry to evaluate. This was massive, but here's where it gets frustrating. The police had almost no physical evidence. The crime scene was compromised by paramedics trying to save Jill's life. There was the bullet casing, the bullet itself, and trace residue on Jill's clothing and hair. That was it, so the police started theorizing. Who would want to kill Jill Dando? And why? Theory number 1. A professional hitman. The precision of the killing, single shot, silenced weapon, execution style, broad daylight, suggested a professional. Some speculated it was a contract killing. But who would hire a hitman to kill a TV presenter? That led to theory number 2. Serbian warlords. Okay, stay with me, because this gets wild. In April 1999, NATO was bombing Serbia during the Kosovo War. Just days before Jill's death, a Serbian opposition journalist named Slavko Kurovija was assassinated outside his home in Belgrade using an identical method. Grabbed from behind, shot in the head at close range. Michael Mansfield QC, during a later trial, raised the possibility that Jill was killed on orders from Serbian warlord Željko Ragnatović, known as Arkan, in revenge for her involvement in a charity campaign for Kosovan refugees. Some people pointed to the bullet casing found at the scene, which showed signs of crimping, supposedly similar to Yugoslav ammunition. But many people, including BBC World Affairs editor John Simpson, dismissed this theory. Simpson said if Serbia wanted to target the BBC, he would have been an easier target since he was actually in Belgrade covering the bombing. Theory number 3. A Crimewatch revenge killing. This was an obvious angle. Jill hosted a show about catching criminals. Maybe someone she'd helped convict, or someone connected to them, wanted revenge. But investigators couldn't find any specific threat or connection. Theory number 4. An obsessed stalker or fan. Just 2 days before her murder, Jill appeared on the cover of Radio Times magazine. She was routinely on TV, in people's homes. She'd recently announced her engagement. Maybe some obsessed fan couldn't handle the idea of her marrying someone else? With no clear evidence pointing to any one theory, the investigation started running in circles. Months passed. The pressure to solve Britain's most high-profile murder since the Yorkshire Ripper was immense. If you're as hooked as I am right now, subscribe, because we're about to get to the part where they arrested someone, the wrong someone. By early 2000, nearly a year after the murder, the police were desperate. And that's when they started looking at local residents with, let's call them, concerning backgrounds. Barry Michael George was born on April 15, 1960. He lived alone in Fulham, just half a mile from Jill's house, and his life story was complicated. George had a long history with law enforcement. In 1982, he was convicted of indecent assault. In 1983, attempted rape. Also in 1983, he was fined for trespassing on the property of Princess Diana. Yeah, that Princess Diana. He'd tried to get into Kensington Palace. He'd also been arrested for impersonating a police officer, for carrying a knife, for molesting women. The guy was a registered sex offender with clear psychological issues. At the time of Jill's murder, George was using the fake name Barry Bulsara, telling people he was the cousin of Freddie Mercury, whose real name was Farrokh Bulsara. He was a Walter Mitty character, living in a fantasy world, making up identities, obsessed with celebrities. And here's where the police got interested. After the murder, George contacted various businesses asking for alibi video footage to prove he wasn't involved. But because he was using different names, the police system initially failed to connect these separate tips as referring to the same person. Eventually, witnesses came forward saying they'd seen George in Jill's street, 4 hours before the murder and again shortly after, in an agitated state. 2 neighbors identified George as the man they'd seen acting suspiciously opposite Jill's house on the morning of the murder. On May 25, 2000, over a year after the murder, police arrested Barry George. When they searched his flat, they found stuff. Photos of George posing with a blank-firing pistol similar to the weapon believed to have been used. Newspaper clippings about Jill's murder. Handwritten lists of names and personal details of various British female celebrities. But notably, no material specifically about Jill Dando was found in his apartment. Which is weird, right? If he was obsessed with her specifically, where was the evidence of that obsession? Still, the police thought they had their man. And then the forensics came back. Here's where everything hinges on something so small, you literally can't see it with the naked eye. About a year after the murder, forensic scientists examining Barry George's coat, a coat hanging in his kitchen, found a single particle of firearm discharge residue, FDR, in the inside pocket. This particle was less than 1/100th of a millimeter in size, microscopic. But the analysis showed it had similarities to the FDR found on Jill Dando at the crime scene. For the police and prosecutors, this was the smoking gun. Literally. This particle proved Barry George had fired the weapon that killed Jill Dando. But hold on. Let's think about this. A forensic scientist later stated that potentially 1 in 100 people could have gunshot residue on their clothing, picked up from someone else, maybe a hobby shooter, maybe an armed police officer. And this particle was found a year later, after George's coat had been handled by police, placed on a mannequin for photos, stored in evidence. Couldn't it have been contamination? The defense argued exactly that. But at the trial, the prosecution made it sound like this particle was definitive proof. In early 2001, nearly 2 years after the murder, Barry George's trial began at the Old Bailey in London. It was led by trial judge Mr. Justice Gage, with Orlando Pownall QC as prosecutor and Michael Mansfield QC as defense attorney. The prosecution's case rested on 4 main points. George fit the general description of the man seen fleeing the scene. He'd been identified as being in Jill's street that morning. He'd lied about knowing who Jill Dando was, and tried to create a fake alibi: the firearms residue particle in his coat pocket. Prosecutor Orlando Pownall described how George had an exaggerated interest in television personalities and firearms. He painted a picture of an obsessed stalker with a violent history. Michael Mansfield, for the defense, argued that Jill's death was caused by a professional hitman, and that without the microscopic speck of alleged firearms residue, the prosecution would have no evidence whatsoever. Mansfield also pointed out something crucial. George had accumulated photographs and personal details of many other female TV presenters, but nothing specifically about Jill Dando was found in his apartment. If he was obsessed with her, where was the evidence? George was also diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and had an IQ of 75, placing him in the lowest 5% of the population. Could someone with these cognitive limitations really have planned and executed such a professional killing? The defense brought in expert witnesses who challenged the firearms evidence, pointing out the possibility of contamination, but after more than 30 hours of deliberation over 5 days, the jury returned a guilty verdict by a majority of 10-1 on July 10, 2001. Barry George was sentenced to life in prison. Case closed, right? The police got their man. Justice was served. Britain could rest easy knowing Jill Dando's killer was behind bars. Except, a lot of people weren't convinced. George's sister, Michelle Diskin, immediately spoke out, saying the case had been built entirely on circumstantial evidence, and justice had not been served. And she had a point. Think about what the prosecution actually proved. George was weird and had a history of stalking women. He'd been seen in the area, though not positively identified as the killer. He'd lied about some things. There was a microscopic particle in his coat pocket. That's it. No murder weapon. No witnesses to the actual shooting. No clear motive. No physical evidence tying him to the scene except that one particle. In 2002, George's first appeal was dismissed, but behind the scenes, something was happening. Dr. Ian Evett, a senior scientist at the Forensic Science Service who pioneered techniques for evaluating forensic evidence, became concerned about how the FDR evidence had been presented at trial. Evett realized that the prosecution had essentially told the jury, this particle probably came from the murder weapon. Therefore, George is guilty. But they hadn't properly considered, what's the probability this particle came from somewhere else? Remember, 1 in every 100 people might have gunshot residue on their clothing from indirect sources. George lived near a territorial army facility. Armed police were common in London. There were multiple ways that particle could have gotten there. In 2006, the Forensic Science Services introduced new guidelines concluding that a cautious approach should be adopted with single particles of firearms residue, and it was unlikely any evidential weight could be attached to them. In other words, the smoking gun evidence wasn't evidence at all. The Criminal Cases Review Commission ordered a new expert analysis. The new report concluded that it would be just as likely that a single particle would have been recovered from George's coat, whether or not he was the person who shot Jill Dando a year previously. The evidence was, scientifically speaking, worthless. On November 15, 2007, the Court of Appeal quashed George's conviction, ruling it unsafe. In 2008, Barry George faced a retrial. This time, without the firearms residue evidence carrying any weight, the case fell apart. The defense pointed out that 3 women from a disability charity placed George's arrival at their offices at 11:50 or 12, which would have made it impossible for him to have committed the murder at 11:30 and then gone home to change. 2 neighbors who almost certainly saw the murderer immediately after the shooting had failed to identify George at an identification parade. And without the forensic evidence, What did the prosecution have? Just circumstantial connections and the fact that George was a weird guy with a troubled past. On August 1, 2008, after just over a day of deliberations, the jury unanimously acquitted Barry George. He walked out of the Old Bailey a free man after spending 8 years in prison for a murder he may not have committed. So Barry George was freed. Justice served, right? An innocent man released. Not exactly. George applied for $1.4 million in compensation for wrongful imprisonment. In April 2010, the Ministry of Justice, under Jack Straw, denied his claim. Why? The Supreme Court ruled that a miscarriage of justice required evidence to be so undermined that no conviction could possibly be based upon it. The court concluded that George had received a reasonable first trial, and his successful appeal was based on technical issues rather than proof of innocence. In other words, yeah, maybe you didn't do it, but the trial was fair at the time, so no compensation for you. George later won damages from tabloid newspapers for various libelous claims about him, but he never got compensation for those 8 years in prison. He moved to Ireland to be closer to his sister, and has lived quietly since then. Senior investigating officer Hamish Campbell stated in a BBC documentary that he did not believe Jill's killer would ever be found and brought to justice. Let's run through the theories again, because 25 years later, they're all still on the table. The Serbian connection. In 2019, 4 men from the Serbian Secret Service were convicted of Jill's murder by a Serbian court. But these verdicts were reversed on appeal in 2024, leading to widely criticized acquittals. So that theory went nowhere concrete. The Crimewatch revenge. Still possible, but investigators never found a specific connection to anyone Jill had helped convict. The obsessed stalker. Jill's brother Nigel believes it was just someone who was in that street who may or may not have known she lived there, who was armed at the time, who recognized her, and thought they could get 5 minutes of notoriety by shooting her. Random. Senseless. No grand conspiracy, just someone wanting to be famous. The professional hit. The method. Single shot. Silenced weapon. Precision. No witnesses. Still suggests professional training. But if it was a hit, who ordered it? And why? The truth is, the case remains unsolved. The Metropolitan Police have long since scaled back active investigation, though they maintain the case could be reopened if new evidence emerges. Quick reminder to subscribe because we're not done yet. We need to talk about what this case reveals about justice itself. Let's be real about what happened here. The police were under massive pressure to solve Britain's most high-profile murder. The media was relentless. The public wanted answers, and the longer the case went unsolved, the worse the Met looked. So, what did they do? They focused on Barry George, a local man who fit their theory that this was the work of an obsessive fan. His odd behavior, his criminal history, his proximity to the crime scene, he was, as one article put it, a likely candidate. But being a likely candidate isn't the same as being guilty. The problem is that once the police decided George was their man, they seemed to stop looking elsewhere. They had their suspect. They had their microscopic particle of evidence. They had enough circumstantial connections to build a case. And a jury convicted him. Think about that. 10 out of 11 jurors believed, beyond reasonable doubt, that Barry George murdered Jill Dando. Based on what? A particle that could have come from anywhere. Some behavioral quirks. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The pressure to find a killer made the criminal justice system reckless. They didn't frame George, I'm not saying that, but they convinced themselves he was guilty based on evidence that, in hindsight, wasn't nearly strong enough. And an intellectually disabled man with Asperger's syndrome spent 8 years in prison for a crime he probably didn't commit. Here's where we get into speculation territory. But some of these theories are worth considering because they're based on actual evidence and patterns. The copycat theory. Just days before Jill's murder, Serbian opposition journalist Slavko Kurovića was assassinated outside his home in Belgrade using an identical method. In 2012, Kurovića's widow declared, "I think there is a link between Dando and Kurovića. I think they were both executed. 2 journalists, 2 doorstep executions, 2 single shots to the head. Same time period. Coincidence? The organized crime theory. Maybe Jill had reported on something or someone powerful who wanted her silenced. The professional nature of the hit suggests someone with resources and training. The random madness theory. This is actually the most terrifying option. Maybe it really was just someone with a gun who recognized her and, in a moment of madness or desire for notoriety, decided to shoot her. No grand conspiracy, no rational motive, just chaos. Jill's funeral took place on May 21, 1999, at Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare. Thousands lined the streets. The nation mourned. Her fiancé, Alan Farthing, alongside Nick Ross, her Crimewatch co-host, raised almost $1.5 million to establish the Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science at University College London, founded on April 26, 2001, the second anniversary of her murder. The institute researches crime prevention, forensic science, and security. It's Jill's legacy, using science to prevent the kind of senseless violence that took her life. But here's what gets me. Jill died intestate, without a will. Her estate, valued at $607,000 after debts and taxes, went to her father. She was planning a wedding. She had her whole life ahead of her. She probably never imagined she'd need a will at 37. This case became a media sensation. Every tabloid had a theory. Every documentary had a new angle. Netflix made a 3-part series. There have been countless TV specials, podcasts, articles, and all that media attention. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it keeps the case alive. Maybe someone out there knows something and will finally come forward. Jill's brother Nigel has said repeatedly that he hopes new media coverage will prompt someone's memory or conscience. On the other hand, the media circus puts enormous pressure on police to solve cases quickly. And when that pressure becomes unbearable, mistakes get made. Like convicting Barry George on evidence that wouldn't hold up to proper scrutiny. The forensic scientist who found that particle probably genuinely believed it was significant. The prosecutors probably genuinely believed they had the right man. The jury certainly believed it. But belief isn't the same as truth. So here we are, 25 years after Jill Dando was murdered on her doorstep in broad daylight. 25 years of investigations, theories, trials, appeals, documentaries, speculation. And we're no closer to knowing who killed her. Before I wrap this up, seriously, subscribe now. This is the kind of deep investigative content you need. Let me lay out what we know for absolute certain. Jill Dando was shot dead outside her home on April 26, 1999, at approximately 11:30 a.m. It was the biggest murder investigation conducted by the Metropolitan Police since the Yorkshire Ripper. Barry George was convicted in 2001, but acquitted in 2008 after the forensic evidence was discredited. No other suspect has been charged, and the case remains unsolved. What we don't know: who actually killed her, why they killed her, whether it was random or planned, whether we'll ever know the truth. And here's what really haunts me about this case. It could happen to anyone. Jill Dando wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She wasn't investigating a criminal organization. She wasn't threatened. She was just a TV presenter going to her house on a Monday morning. And someone shot her. Once, precisely, and walked away. That's the nightmare scenario that keeps criminologists up at night. Because if we can't solve this, with all the resources, all the attention, all the pressure to find answers, what hope is there for cases that don't get that level of scrutiny? Some people think Barry George did it and got away with it due to technicalities. Some think he was a scapegoat who spent 8 years in prison for nothing. Some think there's a Serbian connection the British government doesn't want to pursue. Some think it was a stalker who's never been on anyone's radar. Jill's brother Nigel thinks it was random, someone who got 5 minutes of infamy and then disappeared back into obscurity. Maybe that's the most disturbing possibility of all, that there's no grand conspiracy, no complex motive, no pattern to figure out. Just chaos. Just someone with a gun and a momentary impulse to destroy a life. The case will probably never be solved. Hamish Campbell, who led the investigation, doesn't believe the killer will ever be found. The evidence is cold. The witnesses are gone, or their memories have faded. The gun was never found. Any DNA evidence was compromised at the scene. Unless someone comes forward with new information, unless the killer confesses, or someone who knows the truth finally speaks up, Jill Dando's murder will remain one of Britain's most baffling unsolved cases. And somewhere out there, if they're still alive, her killer is walking free. Maybe they think about it. Maybe they've convinced themselves they had a reason. Maybe they don't think about it at all. But they got away with murder. They took a beloved public figure, someone millions of people trusted and admired. And they killed her for reasons we'll probably never understand. That's the story of Jill Dando. Not a story about justice served, not a story about closure, but a story about how sometimes, even with all our technology, all our resources, all our determination, evil just wins. And we're left with questions that will never be answered. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into cases that challenge everything you thought you knew about justice. Share this if you think someone out there might have information. Comment if you have theories I didn't cover. Because 25 years later, someone still knows what happened that morning in Fulham. And maybe, just maybe, they're ready to talk.